Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I am Brian Zimmerman, Custom Content Editor for Becker's Hospital Review. We'll begin today's webinar with a presentation, and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. We look forward to hearing your questions. Additionally, in about a week following the webinar, we'll be sending you a copy of the presentation to the email you used to register. Now, I'm going to turn the floor over to Naya Kihayes, Principal of ECG Management Consultants, to begin today's presentation.
Thank you, Brian. It's very nice to be here. Today, we're going to be going over the following items and is the agenda for our meeting. One, we're going to do some formal introductions and then go over background information, followed by a payer contract review, data collection, payer mix and volume, and then talk about demonstrating value to payers. And moving on to just introduce my colleague, Greg DeConcilius, who's also here today on our panel. Greg is the administrator of Boston Outpatient Surgical Suites. Greg, can you just make a few comments on your background?
Yeah, thanks, Naya, and thanks for letting me be here. As you can see, my background is clinical. As a physician assistant, I've worked in orthopedic surgery for about 20 years, almost 20 years. And in 2004, I left the hospital I was working at and started Boston Outpatient Surgical Suites. We're a multi-specialty ASC located in the Metro West Boston area. It's in Waltham, Massachusetts. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the center in a bit.
Great, thank you. We're moving on now to our faculty disclosures. Before we get started, the Faculty of Consulting Relationships with Pacira Pharmaceuticals. The program is not accredited for continuing medical education, and attendees will not receive CME credit. This program is sponsored by Pacira Pharmaceuticals. I'm going to first start out with the objectives of our webinar today. We will focus on the key steps to preparing for successful payer contract negotiations with an emphasis on enabling new business and restructuring contracts. Compiling all existing contracts to identify key terms and reimbursement methodologies is the first place we're going to start. And then we're going to move on to demonstrating the value to commercial payers as a result of Medicare reimbursement and ASC rule changes. I want to just make some additional comments on some of the four major rule changes that had some favorable implications for ASCs this year. Device-intensive codes were changed from 40% to 30% factor, which enabled more orthopedic codes in particular to get an increase in reimbursement as a result of the device-intensive code allocation. We'll go over some examples of that later today in the webinar. The ASC hospital payment indicator for the conversion factor is now based upon hospital market basket rather than CPIU, which puts ASCs on the same playing field as hospitals with respect to the rate increase on the conversion factor. However, we do have some limitations with a rescaler, but that is a move in the right direction on getting onto the same indicator as hospitals. The other important rule change that occurred was EXPRAL is now covered for separate reimbursement using C9290. There are currently 2 doses which are reimbursed. The first dose is 266 milligrams or 20 milliliters for vial, which is reimbursed at $324.52. And the second dose is 133 milligrams, which is a 10 milliliter vial, and it is reimbursed by Medicare at $162.26. There are 2 things to note that are important is Medicare updates drug pricing on a quarterly basis. So those numbers are subject to change. In addition to the fact that this is a great thing for ASCs. Historically, there has not been a lot of coverage and reimbursement for drugs. And the fact that we got a change in the payment status indicator allowing EXPRAL for separate reimbursement provides opportunity for ASCs to have access. And then fourth, as a result of the change in the definition of surgery, there were a significant number of cardiac cath lab codes that were added to the ASC list, which again affords more opportunities for ASCs to expand their business. So those are some exciting things about the rule changes, and they have a lot of implications on how you approach a payer. And so third objective of today's webinar is understanding your ASC's payer mix in relation to its existing business and adding new procedures. And then finally, how do you collect the data and effectively approach payers? So we will move on to the next slide and go over a little bit of background information on Boston Outpatient with Greg DeContinuous. So,
yeah,
Greg,
thanks.
I've got a couple of questions for you.
Okay.
Can you tell us about Boston Outpatient Surgical Suite and the types of surgical services that are provided there, as well as any trends and opportunities in case mix? And then we're also interested in understanding if your physicians are using Expro at BOSS, and what types of cases are they using. And I'm going to ask Brian if he can move us to slide 8 while you're in the process of answering these questions, because we've got some nice data that you've shared with us on BOSS.
Yeah, and I think, thanks, Naya. I think, seeing it visually for those who are visual is helpful. And most importantly, I mentioned we're a multi-specialty ASC. We provide services, orthopedic and pain management, basically, and some general surgery. But as you can see in this slide here, I'm probably much like, those on the call where, volume hasn't grown tremendously. We've been pretty flat. Again, you may be different in your own area. One important fact to realize is that I am speaking to you today as a administrator of a surgery center in Massachusetts. Obviously, every market's different. So just, take that with a grain of salt. I'm giving you kind of my perspective. But, we, with, physician employment, direction of referrals, those types of things, we've seen our volume be pretty flat for the most part. Now, you'll see here, we've had a volume decline by 4.5% since 2015, but really that loss was in pain management. And again, if you do pain management, you've probably seen a lot of that as well, those cases going back to the office setting, et cetera. And so, as you can see, we've seen orthopedic growth as well. And if you go to the next slide, please, Brian, you'll see a lot of the shift has been, this is, again, our market analysis. And again, you probably see it much across the country as well. But you'll see a big amount of growth, particularly in the seniors who are 60 plus. Now, that's important for a couple of reasons. First off, because we're talking about Medicare a lot today, those patients will oftentimes be covered by Medicare. And so the changes Medicare's having will impact your bottom line and your business. Obviously, Medicare's changes to orthopedics 2 years ago now, were really important to us. And we'll see that growth as we go forward. And the other reason why I think this is important is, as you can see, we have a good snapshot of what's going on within our market. And I think it's important for you on the call, if you're an administrator, to realize where you guys are at in terms of your market and where the opportunities are. You've seen we've had a flat or drop in our volume, but orthopedics has increased. And we've recognized an opportunity to bring some higher acuity cases over from the hospital. We started doing joint replacements about 1.5 years ago now. We've only done about 60 of them, and most of them have been add-on cases. We really don't have any block time for our set joint surgeons. So, we've been doing additional, hips, knees, shoulders, everything, and it's helped out tremendously. We'll talk in a bit about the clinical pathway we developed to bring those cases over, and much of that transition was through the use of Exparel. We've started using it again about 1.5 years ago, but what we found that was once we put it on our formulary, we really identified other opportunities for its use. We do large, multi-ligament reconstructions, osteotomies, and now we've kind of morphed into the clinical indications like, patients with pain management issues, a history of opioid abuse, those types of things. So again, we've been using it for a while, and it's helped us expand our case mix. And again, as we look forward to the increased rise in orthopedic cases and the transition, again, particularly joint replacements and spine, we'll see our continued use.
So, Greg, I have one other question for you.
Yep.
Because of uni-knee being covered by Medicare and a couple of the other total joints, as we all know, total knee is not there yet, but we hope we'll see it soon. Are you doing any uni-knees or other total joints on Medicare patients at BOSS, or are you just doing commercial patients right now?
We've been doing uni-knees pretty much since they've been approved. And again, that has been the big movement for our joints was bringing over the total joints, and that's been going on for about 1.5 years. We don't do any Medicare cases; they're all commercials, contracts that, again, I'll talk about it a little bit, but contracts that we've gone to the commercial payers and negotiated carve-outs or addition to our contracts for those total joint replacement codes.
Okay, thank you.
And that's really it on that. So if you want to jump to the next slide.
Great. I think I'll take it here, and we're going to go over payer contract review, and we're going to start with an overview of payment methodologies and talk a little bit about the implications on the ASC's business. There's several methodologies that you'll find more commonplace than others with commercial payers, but I also want to note that many payers may have a distinct and unique proprietary type of system that may take the form of one of these primary payment systems that you see out there, and they may adopt or they may modify. So, the Medicare payment system is, known as the Outpatient Prospective Payment System. ASCs and HOPDs are both on the Outpatient Prospective Payment System. However, there are nuances and differences between the two organizations. For example, entities, for example, Exparel is not on the approved list for HOPD, but it is on the approved list for ASC. So that's a great example of just one of the differences, aside from many others. But the ambulatory payment classification was established by Medicare as part of the OPPS, or Outpatient Prospective Payment System. And it originally started to compensate hospitals for outpatient services. And then it was implemented in ASCs and actually fully transitioned in 2012. The initial goal was to establish a uniform payment methodology for outpatient surgery, regardless of location of service. But what's interesting is there definitely is still some deviations, but it certainly puts this different sites of service on a similar payment system, which was the goal. Sometimes you'll see a commercial contract that's based upon a percentage of Medicare. And the contract will just say it's based upon 150% of Medicare. And this is typically based upon the allowed amounts, i.e. the reimbursement rates in total that are a function of the Outpatient Prospective Payment System. However, those can vary depending upon the year that your contract is. So some people may have a contract that says 2018 Medicare versus current Medicare versus 2016. Those are very important things to look at in your contract if you've got a contract based upon Medicare, is understanding what year they are based on. The next methodology is Medicare groupers. This is the old-fashioned Medicare groupers before OPPS came into play. And it was the historical payment system for ASCs based upon a grouping of codes. It originally started out with 9, then expanded on, I think there was an additional 52 groupers added. And all of the ASC eligible CPT codes were mapped into different groupings. There are still commercial payers that use Medicare grouper as a foundation. And so they'll call them groupers or ambulatory payment groupers, or moving on to the next one, outpatient grouper, enhanced grouper, APG, OPG, outpatient payment grouper. And some of those are based upon initially the Medicare grouper system, and then they're typically deviate from it with updates and things that make it unique. So the payer uses Medicare groupers as a foundation, and then they typically modify the mappings, or they add new groupers. They might take it from 9 to 12, or they may use the original 9 and then have a bunch of different groupers that are their own that don't even mirror the same CPT codes. They may expand and include things like total joints that are not on the approved ASC Medicare list, but they're on the approved commercial list. It's important that you get a copy of those mappings and understand the complete payer methodology. The next methodology is a fixed fee schedule. Those are typically proprietary fee schedules that payers basically put a price or a reimbursement rate specific to a CPT code. Sometimes they can be based upon a percentage of Medicare or groupers, and then they may include carve-outs, i.e. they add different types of codes to their list, and they make that proprietary. And then finally, I want to talk about the concept of carve-outs. Carve-outs are CPT codes that have been, i.e. carved out of a payer's payment methodology and paid at a negotiated rate. So if a CPT code or a procedural code is in a grouper or in a APC that the value is negotiated at a different number, then the payer will carve that code out if they're willing to do so and pay it at a separate and distinct rate that does not follow the contract logic. These are usually, carve-outs are usually typically used to address high-cost services, high volume services, and CPT codes that are not eligible for payment under the standard methodology. It may also be used for high cost drugs, supplies, implants, et cetera. So we can move on to the next slide. I'm going to talk about some key terms and methodologies that are applicable to commercial payers, then kind of compare and contrast to when a payer follows Medicare. The most common scenarios for implants when they are covered under contract include implants payable at cost or based upon a percentage of charge equivalent to cost. So if the payer is going to pay you 100% of cost and they tell you that the reimbursement is 50% of billed charges, then your markup has to be 200% of cost, so that 50% of billed charges equals cost. If it's 100% of billed charges, then the charges are cost. It's kind of complicated, but sometimes payers put language in there like that so that they don't have to manually administer your claim. And so it's important to understand what that charge has to be compliant with the language of the contract on implants. Multiple procedure logic. Some of the most common scenarios you'll see is 100% for the highest allowed amount, followed by 50% for all subsequent procedures. Second scenario you might see is 100% for the primary procedure, i.e. the highest allowed amount, followed by 50% for secondary, 25% for the third physician, and 0 thereafter. So if you have a code combination in excess of 3 codes in a case, you won't get paid for the 4th code. Another combination might be 150-0, which means you're only getting paid for the first 2 codes on the claim that are in the highest allowed amount positions. And then finally, 100%, i.e. or a case rate where you do not get paid for multiple procedures and you only get paid for 1 code, which is typically driven by the primary procedure. If the payment method is proprietary, it is important to confirm the payer's mappings and obtain complete fee schedules. Do not just take the examples that quite often will be found in the payer's contract. It's important to ask your provider network representative or the person that you are working with on a new contract for the entire mapping that is associated with the contract. Next, you should confirm that that you have the payer's complete list of ASC approved codes. They do not always follow Medicare. They quite often will deviate with commercial payers. So ask them for their complete list of all codes. You might find that total joints are approved, as Greg was mentioning earlier, that he's doing this with commercial payers. Determine whether the payer follows Medicare policy and seek confirmation on whether updates to their contract methodology are tandem with the Medicare updates. So if the payer doesn't follow the reimbursement system, they may follow policy, meaning they may add a code when Medicare adds a code. They may add a code and also price it, just like Medicare has. So if there are new codes added to the Medicare list, check to see if the payer is adding. If they've changed the way they pay for multiple procedures, you also want to check to see if the payer is following that type of logic as well. So that is important to review. But we can move on to the next slide and look a little bit further at Medicare. So in general, the key fundamentals about Medicare is that Medicare does not reimburse separately for implants in the ASC. Codes may be packaged, which does not allow for reimbursement for certain add-on codes or multiple procedures. For example, a lot of the spine codes are packaged, so you will not get paid for secondary codes or third codes in spine because they all roll up to the primary code and they do not pay for the add-ons or multiple procedures. Multiple procedure logic with Medicare is interesting though, because some codes are actually not discounted and they're paid at 100% of their value, while other codes are reduced by 50%. And again, there's others that are add-ons and they're packaged and not allowed for any additional reimbursement. Device-intensive codes are a classification that is given to a procedure where more than, in 2019, 30% of the cost reported by HOPDs for that procedure is attributed to the device or implant cost. When we have a CPT code that has got a device-intensive code indication and has that device-intensive code status, it typically has a favorable impact on reimbursement because it gives the ASC additional reimbursement to compensate for the high-cost device or implants. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. So some drugs and biologicals are allowed for separate reimbursement, as we've already talked about, which includes Exparel. Payment is not reduced by Medicare when they appear in multiple positions. So if drugs, high-cost supplies, implants are pursued for coverage, ASCs can seek a carve-out with commercial payers, but obviously we can't do that with Medicare. But I think that's one of the important takeaways, when we do not have coverage for high-cost items and implants when we're looking at different payment methodologies. So moving on to the next slide. A couple of questions I have for Greg relative to payment systems and looking at your contracts. Greg, how often do you review and negotiate your payer contracts?
Well, first off, Naya, I mean, that's a great review. I think it just exhibits the point that, contracts can make your head spin with all the details, right? And so we are fortunate that we have a management company who, and they review all of our contracts, and they do a terrific job at it. Now, again, those on the call have varying backgrounds and varying facilities they work for. And so if you don't have a management company, and how we did it before we had a management company, is I think the best thing to do is really develop some kind of tickler file, some kind of Excel spreadsheet that lists all of your contracts, lists when they expire, and kind of a timeline on when you should be going to the payer for reviewing those contracts. Again, that should be at least annually, where you're looking at this file and you're kind of, and you're determining when you have to go to them, and you kind of don't miss those dates. The other opportunity would be when you're changing a service line, adding a new procedure code, adding something like Exparel, something to your fee schedule that's going to trigger you going to the payer.
Great, thank you, Greg. And when you've looked at your contracts, and you mentioned that you're expanding service, how many payers contracted with BOSS have a payment method that's either based on Medicare or follows some sort of Medicare policy versus, using their own standard, proprietary type of a payment method? Do you have a sense? Can you give us a sense for that?
Yeah, I mean, as much as I can speak about as far as, again, confidentiality things go. In Massachusetts, we have some large payers, and we'll go through my case mix in a little bit, but we have some large payers, and they kind of have statewide contracts that apply to all of the ASCs throughout the state. And again, and then there's some that you can negotiate on an individual ASC basis. And I would say, I guess, across the board, you'll see some that follow Medicare in some respects, and then there's a bunch that have their proprietary payment methodology. So we're really across the board.
Great. I think that's fairly common across the country, where some payers will follow components of it, but not all of it, and others, have their proprietary payment methods. For those payers that do follow Medicare, some components of it, are they following all policies? Have you found? Are they including any updates? What has been your experience, especially with regard to separate reimbursement for Exparel?
So they do provide updates at a fixed time frame, but we have not seen a situation where they've let us know that they're separately reimbursing for Exparel, unfortunately. I'll talk a little bit about the methods I've taken to try and get Exparel reimbursement. And again, this is something where we had to go to them and kind of let them know this is out there and ask them before, they didn't just come to us and say, we're going to start reimbursing for it. So that hasn't been a good situation so far.
So is it your sense that some of the payers that follow Medicare are following older versions and maybe haven't updated their list, it sounds like, so that maybe they're following 2016 or 17 because their updates have not been rapid and current?
Correct. That's probably what's going on, yeah.
Great. So I think we can move on to data collection next. I'm going to go over some background on doing your homework and why it's important to do your homework when you're preparing to talk to the commercial payers. It's really important that you have your surgeon roster and specialty of existing surgeons. And if you're looking at adding new business, you want to point out who the new surgeons are. What are they interested in? Why are they interested in coming to the surgery center? If you've got availability of their ASC volume by CPT code of the new surgery business you're expecting by bringing in that new surgeon, that will be important, as well as their payer mix, how much of that business represents the payer that you're talking to. If you're doing things like orthopedics or any other type of procedures, general surgery, anything that uses high-cost implants, high-cost supply items, and X-Bra. I mean, other, high-cost supply items are examples like balloon sinusoplasty. You use a balloon, and that's another high-cost supply item that, sometimes you'll want to point those things out. Place of service, where are those physicians currently working? Are they working at hospitals is very important, because if you can move that physician from the hospital to the ASC, there tends to be more opportunity to demonstrate cost savings, to the payer. If your existing surgeons are looking at doing new surgery, it's important to also note that maybe they're only doing some surgeries and they could do more, and they're doing the others at the hospital because maybe your contracts aren't set up for those surgeries, such as total joints or even any new line of business. You're adding a new specialty, your contracts aren't set up for it. Project the new volume if the existing surgeon has the opportunity to bring new cases that you expect to realize at your center. Review of your total reimbursement per case in your existing contracts. If your reimbursement per case, which includes the multiple procedure logic and implants, is not high enough, you're going to want to bring that to the attention of the payer, especially you don't want to start doing cases that result in losses in your business. Understanding the cost data then is very important relative to the reimbursement. If there are cases that are not adequately reimbursed, compile the cost data and demonstrate the losses to the payer. Review implant costs, high cost supplies and drugs, and other items such as laser use fees. If you've got a contract that does not pay implants separately, you want to look at your exposure and your risk to the most expensive case. If you have a shoulder procedure, for example, that has 2 anchors and another one that has 5, you want to make sure you're covering the cost for the 5-anchor case. So also, quite often, doing a comparison of Medicare reimbursement and ASC to HOPD can be very valuable, because quite often the Medicare reimbursement in the hospital setting is more than your surgery center needs sometimes to do it in the ASC setting. So sometimes that can create value and intelligence that helps the payer understand the opportunity of your center and the value that you bring. I'm going to move on to a few questions with Greg on data collection. So Greg, when you've gone to discuss opportunities with payers, can you share with us what types of data you have used to demonstrate the value of BOSS to the payers?
Sure, and I think actually your list is very, very comprehensive, but I'll just highlight kind of some of the experience we've had in the past. I actually enjoy this, and I know, again, based on the varying experience of those in the call, some have clinical experience, some have business experience, some have both. I enjoy the opportunities, and I'll use a joint replacement as an example, to kind of tell the story. And so how we typically do it is, or I've done it in the past, is first off, you have to realize that your rep you may deal with for Blue Cross or whoever it is may not be the most appropriate person. They may be more on the administrative side or what have you. You really got to make sure that that person is going to direct your information over to the appropriate person. But I'll oftentimes reach out to them and talk about an exciting opportunity, not only for the facility, your facility and the patients you're going to serve, but also for the payer to potentially have, shift some cases out of the more expensive hospital or hospital outpatient setting to your ASC. And so, I kind of spelled out initially as kind of the catch. Oftentimes we don't know exactly what the HOPD is getting paid from a commercial payer per se. And so, but we'll ask them to do that kind of analysis, and we'll present some clinical data to them as well. Other things I've done in the past is actually bought the members of that commercial payer to our facility, to actually tour the facility if they haven't been there. We've asked to have medical directors and clinical leaders there, so we can actually have our clinical leaders there as well. We've been very, very lucky with having a multidisciplinary approach with our nursing staff, maybe anesthesiologists, physicians, if you can, again, do this, to have them sit down at a nice formal meeting, if you will, and go over some of the key components of why you're making this shift. Again, highlighting what CPT codes may be affected or what additional carve-out you're looking for. Again, going over things like maybe potentially case costing and what's going to go into it and why you're asking for X. It's always tough, I feel like, to kind of throw a number out there. And so we'll oftentimes ask, unless you're asking for an increase for a particular procedure, will ask for X amount of an increase, or you're asking for a reimbursement for an implant or something like that, or again, in this case, Exparel, you'll ask for X, or you'll use Medicare's reimbursement as an example. It's kind of your benchmark. But, you know, I kind of throw it out to them to come back to us and do their analysis. But again, really being detail-oriented, presenting good information to them, get in front of the right people. And again, if you have the opportunity to do so, bring them in front of you. That'd be really, really helpful. My last piece would be if hopefully you're a member of your state association, and then maybe there's an opportunity to come together as a group. And, you know, sometimes there's strength in numbers, and talk about, you know, kind of a statewide shift in either a case or, you know, some kind of procedure you're adding, et cetera. And, you know, lean on your state association. I know you may not be able to talk specifics about your contract, which may be specific to your ASC, but is there an opportunity to come together and even network and, you know, approach a commercial payer in that sense? So that's
yeah, and on that note too, you know, obviously you're a leader in the state association, and our experience here in Washington as well is on payment policy and things like adding new codes to the list. Those are totally things that you could talk about with the payers, as you were saying, and can be very instrumental in helping payers to change things on their ASC list. What I want to do next is we're going to move on to the next slide, which will show us payer mix and volume. And Greg, let's talk a little bit about this next slide on payer mix and volume. And this is the payer mix that Greg has shared with us from VOS. And the majority of the case mix that is reflected in this payer mix is 74% based on knee arthroscopy, orthopedic procedure, shoulder arthroscopy, and so forth. And I want to point out the significant number of, you know, the commercial mix here, commercial and workers' comp. Greg, when you look at adding new services, you know, how much of, you know, have you seen your payer mix change? You know, how important has that been to the conversations with the payer? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the general comment is that, you know, you should be, if you're on the call, you know, you should be, you know what your case mix is. You know, I'd analyze it, you know, at least, you know, quarterly or monthly. You know, a good time frame for me is always, you know, around our board meeting. And again, I'm fortunate that I have a management company that processes a lot of this information. But, you know, you should be aware of it. And then when you're doing that kind of research on bringing a procedure over, or a device or whatever it is, you need to determine kind of what, you know, now I talked about getting your surgeons over, but what, you know, ask them to run you know, an insurance analysis on kind of their case mix and what kind of cases those are going to be coming over. And then you can carry it down through to, okay, you know, they have mainly Blue Cross cases. You know, I do 27% Blue Cross, and this is on my Blue Cross fee schedule. Or vice versa, it's not on Blue Cross fee schedule, and they do a lot of Blue Cross. The Blue Cross may be somebody I'm gonna have to attack here. And again, you saw at the bottom our actual case mix within our payer mix. You know, where those, again, it's all down to the detail, right? Where that actually those cases fall within those payer contracts. But you have to know your payer contracts, and if it's not you as the administrator or the center leader, it's somebody within your business office manager, somebody within your center who's going to be able to run that through. I will say that no matter what, I always recommend as an administrator to have somebody, again, whether it's you or your business office manager, be the final say on any case that comes to your facility. So you know that if a total joint comes over to you, you know it's only reimbursed by, let's say, Cigna, Blue Cross, and United, and you know if it's a Medicare, you can't do that, obviously. And so, you know, somebody's got to be that, you know, that person who makes those approvals. Again, your schedulers educated, you're educating your offices, your surgeons' offices, and your surgeons' schedulers, so they're aware, and there's kind of that final say within this. But it's really important to know that. I think that's the most important thing about this slide.
Perfect. And now we're going to move on to a couple of questions that you may have actually just answered regarding the case mix changes and biggest opportunities and looking at your payer mix. But can you just make one additional comment? I mean, you talked about total joints and looking at expanding your service. Has your case mix materially changed, you know, other than, you know, looking at total joints, and what have been your biggest opportunities, you know, in adding new services at VOS in the past?
Yeah, once I think the floodgates open, if you will, as I communicated out that, again, total joints were approved, we then saw opportunities for surgeons who are providing these, and maybe they're somebody who primarily does knee scopes or ACLs, but they also may do a uni on the side or a total knee here and there. We looked at them. They've started bringing their cases over. We've also used it as a recruiting opportunity to recruit other surgeons to the center. Word spreads out, et cetera. So we've had surgeons actually contact us. And so I think, it's important to, again, know that what's reimbursed, what's not, and then you'll see your case mix follow suit as those cases start to come through. Another comment I'll make is that your insurers, you better believe that they're going to actually follow up on that. And they'll say, hey, we gave you approval for total joints. Why have we not seen a shift out of the hospital setting? They're also going to want to see that there's an opportunity for them to experience some cost savings by transitioning these cases to an ASC. So.
This is a great comment, and they do certainly follow up. So with that being said, I want to move on and talk about demonstrating the value to payers, and then bring it back to Greg so we can talk a little bit more details about some of the things that have gone into creating value and demonstrating that value. So we've talked a little bit about this, but just a high-level review on the information needs. Here's the ASC can utilize Medicare reimbursement policy and trends to demonstrate the value of EXPAREL to the commercial payer. The information below is critical to demonstrating the value. Again, reviewing the total reimbursement at the case level, ensuring that multiple procedure logic and implants are factored into reimbursement logic as applicable. So if you've got cases that have implants, what's that dollar amount? If the payer doesn't pay for implants, what does the rate need to be to cover and create the best opportunity for covering the cost of your most expensive case? Compare current year Medicare reimbursement to previous year. As a function of the changes, it could help or hurt you. Depends upon which way the Medicare changes have occurred. But it's absolutely a great thing to look at because it's also public information. Evaluate if the contract updates automatically for annual Medicare updates, which we've already spoken to. So on the next slide, I want to go over a commercial payer example and just try to highlight a couple of points here. This slide shows you a case scenario of an ACL repair performed with a meniscectomy. In this particular case, the surgery center is using EXPAREL in the ACL repair. The commercial payer claims that the contract is at 125% of Medicare. But that contract was signed in 2018. However, they have a caveat to it. They pay multiple procedures at 100% for the primary physician, 50% for the second, and 25% of the third. Implants are included just like Medicare. And when you look at this scenario, you will see in 2018, the Medicare rates for the ACL with the meniscectomy were at $3,361. So when you look at the payment in 2019, two things have happened. The ACL actually got changed to a device-intensive code payment indicator. That device-intensive code payment indicator, coupled with the additional reimbursement of EXPAREL, took that code combination, the ACL with the meniscectomy, up 38.3%, from $3,361 to $4,649. So effectively, by 2019, when you compare the payer's so-called 125% of Medicare project, 125% of Medicare, their rate is actually equates to 94% of Medicare based upon 2019. And that is a pretty significant variance and something that would be a very meaningful conversation and how you can use Medicare to demonstrate to the payer that their reimbursement is inadequate and it is not what they're representing it to be because of their nuances and caveats to their methodology. So this is one way of how you can show Medicare to the commercial payer, and perhaps it will give you opportunity to enable a change in your contract. And moving on to that, I want to ask Greg a couple of questions. Greg has is going to share with us 3 different scenarios and some experiences that he has had with different payers. And in the context of these 3 scenarios, Greg, it'd be great if you could touch on the following 3 items. How has BOSS utilized Medicare methodology to support the case of the commercial payer, and what was your outcome? You've already talked a little bit about contacting the payers. If you could expand upon a little bit about what payers' responsiveness has been relative to the Medicare changes and their timeline for updates. And then payers that do not pay separately for implants and other high-cost items, what has been your approach with the payers in the past for demonstrating the value of the center? And so if we could turn to the next slide. Greg, can you go over and give us some examples and share with everybody these 3 different scenarios?
Yeah, and let me talk generally for a second. I was really excited when with EXPAREL's approval and kind of where this is heading for 2 reasons. One, I think the clinical benefit. Again, being in the field for a while and looking at the tremendous opportunity we had to provide such a really, really good product to the patients. Again, I'm in Massachusetts. We're really, a big state as far as opioid abuse goes, and being able to provide this to a patient, and again, reduce the amount of opioids they're going to use, try and cut down on the addiction, those types of things. That was really, really a nice story to tell. And so I told you before, I get excited sometimes going to the payers because oftentimes you're going to them with a nice story to tell. Again, like shifting joints, and again now like, hey, I can provide this drug as an add-on to not only shift cases, but also in that situation where that person will come anyway for a knee scope or a shoulder scope, I can now reduce that patient's need for opioids if they have a history of opioid abuse and a history of pain management issues, et cetera. So that was the first thing. The second thing was, I laugh about this because I thought this was going to be a slam dunk because, we're constantly getting hit with, no matter who it is, oh, Medicare made these changes. They bundled these codes. They got rid of 292.6 decompression, whatever it is. We're constantly getting those additions, which are typically reductions to our fee schedule. They're constantly taking money away from us. I thought, well, I tell that story and say, hey, here's an opportunity where you're actually now going to pay us more. You always follow Medicare, right? And so I thought it was going to be really more of a slam dunk than it has been. Now, I will say I've taken the lead a little bit as president of our state association, and because we utilize the product, but we've seen a couple of different scenarios. First off, one of our contracts is paid based on the HOPD fee schedule, Medicare fee schedule. This has been very, very positive. That payer has actually embraced the data we provided to them and said, we cannot make the change because we pay you on the HOPD fee schedule, and it's not already reimbursed for in the HOPD setting, just the ASC setting. But we're going to actually, we think this is a great product. We're actually going to try and get this changed on our HOPD fee schedule, and they really embrace that. And so they have not given us a timeline. They've basically said, they're going to put it forth to the next meetings, et cetera. I think a key point is whatever you get for feedback, make sure on that little tickler file you're kind of tracking this and making sure you're following up with those pairs at appropriate times to making sure they're still working on this and it doesn't get put in the back burner. Part of the reason I actually made the point was you should lean on your local rep for your local Pacira rep for EXPAREL. Have them work with you to provide you with some data on opioid abuse, on the drug, et cetera. So you're armed with this information when you provide that on the onset. I told you about that earlier when you make your initial introduction. So you're already pleading your case in that initial email, that initial call, that initial formal meeting. Another tactic that I've used is even going to the policymakers for the different insurers, because I think if you're in front of the policymakers, don't forget, policymakers are charged with trying to reduce opioid abuse. And isn't that a great story to tell? Hey, Blue Cross Blue Shield, is making an initiative to reduce opioid abuse by approving this product. And so maybe you utilize them to assist you, et cetera. Again, as we follow down the scenario, we've seen the same kind of thing, that those that follow Medicare, they've said they're aware of it. And it must be that, as Naya explained, their updates are not current, but we asked them for an update, putting this on our fee schedule once they update their fee schedule. And then as far as the proprietary fee schedule goes, one tactic we've taken in the past is, for example, the total joints. As part of my case costing for the total joints, I included the cost of EXPAREL. And so that's why we started using this a year and a half ago. So you could identify certain CPT codes that you'd ask for an increase where you'd see the use of EXPAREL. So you kind of account for that within your fee schedule where you don't have a carve out for implants or high cost disposables or medications such as EXPAREL. Again, I would only urge you to be cautious of the use of this drug. I mean, you know, with its approval for interscalene nerve blocks, you know, we've used it in our shoulder arthroscopies, again, for patients where there's a clinical indication. So trying to get this kind of carved out for additional reimbursement, and don't go crazy with it. I think if you just get it at cost and utilizing Medicare, again, that gold standard is really the way to go with it. And so those are kind of what we see for areas.
So Greg, it sounds like, you know, you've got some payers that maybe haven't added it to the list, but you've been successful in getting the cost covered through a carve out maybe for the CPT code and or the negotiated rate for the actual surgical procedure you're providing. So that is another way to get the cost covered by showing them the cost and Medicare approval. It sounds like you've been successful with that approach.
Yeah, and I think what our next steps would be if we don't see any progress from particularly those of the proprietary fee schedule, but across the board, I think we'll then go back and ask for those particular CPT codes. Again, I mentioned osteotomies, multi-ligament knee reconstructions, things like that. You know, those types of procedures. We'll ask for an increased reimbursement for that particular CPT code if they see it's a tremendous, you know, administrative burden to kind of put this in there. So, yeah, I just think there's such a wide use for this drug that, you know, you don't want to limit yourself. That would be my only recommendation.
All right. Great. Thank you so much. I think we just want to note the indication and then open it up for some questions and answers with the audience. So just want to note the indication for EXPAREL is indicated for single dose infiltration in adults to produce post-surgical local analgesia and as an interscalene brachial plexus nerve block to produce post-surgical regional analgesia. Safety and efficacy have not been established in other nerve blocks. I think we can there's details of the additional safety information, and we can move it on to some questions and answers with the audience.
Thank you for that fantastic presentation. We will now begin today's question and answer session. Please submit any questions you have by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. We'll try to get through as many questions as we can. We've got a bunch of good questions coming in. I'm going to go ahead and start with this one. So how do Medicare updates get communicated to the public?
I can take that. On the Medicare updates, the proposed rule change process starts typically in July, and then by September, the Medicare updates that are in the final rules are going to be stated in final publication typically comes out in November. One of the easiest ways to access the rule updates are either on the Medicare website and or if you're a member of ASC, the National ASC Association, they quite often will post them on the ASC website. That's another great resource to look to.
Thank you, Naya. And this audience member would like to know, so what does HOPD stand for?
Oh, hospital outpatient department. My apologies. I should have clarified that up front.
Oh, great. Thanks for that clarification. And so we've got a bunch more questions coming in. I think let's go with this one. So I believe it was stated, this audience member says, I believe it was stated, if a payer is paying implants for 50% of CBC, how did you come up with the 200% increase number?
Oh, because if your cost is $100 and they only pay you 50%, you're only going to get paid $50. So you have to double it in order to get to the cost. Gotcha.
Thank you. And so our next question here is, what do you use as an average reimbursement rate for ASC procedures? Do you think 400% of Medicare is a reasonable ask?
From the standpoint that no two payers pay surgery centers on the same methodology, and there's no, in my opinion, straight rate that will be applicable to all procedures. I think you really have to analyze your business, and you have to understand what percentage of Medicare, if you're actually negotiating in terms of Medicare, is applicable to your book of business. I think 400% is a very high number in general across the United States, but it may not be a very high number for a high cost, high intensive procedure that doesn't get paid for multiple procedures and doesn't have payment for implants. It really depends on the rest of the payment logic in the contract, as well as your case mix and what your costs are.
Great. And so this audience member asks, have you done any analytics based on our payer mix? What is the optimum cost basis annually will be the most profitable for our center? Or do you always negotiate lowest price for all implants? Does that make sense?
Not 100%.
Okay.
You always negotiate the lowest price for all implants?
Yes.
I'm not following that question. I think I can answer from the standpoint that you're always wanting to manage the risk for the most expensive scenario, especially if implants are not covered in the contract and they're all included. So if implants are included, you want to control for your risk of the most expensive case. If you have an ACL with an allograft versus an endobutton, for example, or a graft versus an endobutton, the graft is going to probably cost a whole lot more than if you're using an endobutton or some other, not using a graft. So that's an example. So I'd want to control for that case, just like I mentioned about the anchors in a shoulder repair.
Great, thank you. That's helpful. And so our next question here is, do you see more private payers embracing the OPPS or Medicare grouper payment methodology?
Many commercial payers that will use some components of Medicare, but as Greg eloquently described, a lot of them do not follow it to the letter of the law. They use components of it, and they may even tell you that they follow Medicare, but that's why you have to get the details of the payment system to make sure you know what year it is, to make sure they're actually following multiple procedure logic, to make sure that their list is the same as Medicare and it's the current list. They quite often will say they follow Medicare, but it quite often means they don't follow all components of it. Greg, do you have anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think you're right there. I think you're good. Nothing to add.
Great. We've got a question here to address to Greg. So do you strive to align your reimbursement methodologies to be consistent with each payer, or is that a challenge?
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't that be wonderful, right? I think it's, and again, Naya could probably say generally if that ever happens, but I would assume in a state it's very, very difficult to have kind of, if you will, like standard kind of contracts across the board. I will say we try to have as much consistency as possible. I can only emphasize that those intricacies have to be, again, known by somebody. In this case, it's me or my business office manager, and any kind of out of your normal case, things like maybe biologicals or things that you may be doing out of the ordinary, or in this case, maybe an exparel, maybe an anesthesiologist reviews a case and says, oh, we can do this case here, this person has a history of opioid abuse, but we'll have to use exparel. That has to kind of go through somebody, so it's kind of administered, if you will. And so everybody should know your contracts that touches the booking sheets and touches the scheduling. So again, that's your scheduler, and I would advise having 1 to 2 meetings a year with your surgeons' schedulers. Have them out to your facility, have breakfast, have lunch for them, et cetera, and go over the little intricacies of your bookings and changes, et cetera, of your insurance contracts. So they know what cases can come and can't. So I think it's an ideal world. Too much to have them too consistent.
Great, thank you, Greg. We've got a bunch of great questions coming in. I'll take this one next. So if you provide the payer with your costs, do you also provide an expected margin on those costs?
Typically, I do not disclose my full financial statements to the payer because your payer mix dives into that. If you were a surgery center that you have payers that you're servicing that perhaps you're not being paid adequately, such as a Medicare or Medicaid patient, you have to factor that in to what your total cost is of doing business. I quite certainly, commercial payers don't like to hear it, but it is reality. And a lot of times, we'll have the conversation about if you have a heavy Medicare or Medicaid mix that you're servicing these populations. And unfortunately, that does impact what your requirements are from the commercial payer as well. But typically, I think that you choose, when you have the information that presents and supports your case to the payer on cost, you have to be careful with costs, that you don't forget about things like capital expenditures and things like that. It's important to focus on, when it is reasonable and what you have, the kind of data that you have that's appropriate to demonstrate the case that you're trying to make.
Great.
The only thing I'll add will be, just those details of the case cost. Again, if you don't know what your actual costs are, again, if you're maybe have a business background, et cetera, utilize your clinical resources, whether it's a nurse manager, your physicians, et cetera, maybe a physician champion. And there are plenty of conferences out there, that kind of teach you some of these methodologies to know your costs. And so, you have to really know where you stand before you go to the table.
Great. And we're coming up towards the end of the hour here, so I think we have time for one more question. And this audience member would like to know, what is the average reimbursement difference at an ASC versus an HOPD?
In general, based upon Medicare or based upon commercial payers, commercial payers is all over the board, and that's not published information. If you get EOBs, perhaps from a patient, if you're a physician-owned surgery center and you get EOBs, and you can get intelligence more of what the differential is. But on Medicare, HOPD is about 90 to 95% higher on Medicare than it is in an ASC. But if you've got device intensive codes and things like that, it's lower. That gap is not as wide. It's a wide range, but it's pretty substantial. And that's why using Medicare and HOPD to demonstrate your case can be pretty effective, because it's safe to assume that the commercial payer isn't paying the hospital 100% of Medicare.
Great. And I want to thank the audience for being so engaged today and asking some great questions. And I'm going to take this time now to turn the floor back over to you, Naya, for a few closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been a great day here, and we've enjoyed the webinar. I just wanted to provide a couple of notices. We will be doing a follow-up webinar, part 2 to the series on payer contract negotiation, developing a business case to optimize reimbursement options. And that will be on Wednesday, May 22nd at 11 a.m. to noon Central Time. It is the second of the series of contract negotiations aimed at preparing and optimizing payer contract negotiations. It will focus on the importance of developing and presenting a business case to the payer in order to optimize reimbursement options for products and supplies used in surgical procedures and implants and things like that. We will have a ASC administrator panelist again, and perhaps some others. And the key elements will be understanding the need and value of developing a business case, developing a payer strategy and approach, building the business case, and presenting it to the payer. And then finally, if you want to learn more about XBRAL and there's some additional resources located on the Pacira Pharmaceuticals website at www.xbral.com/reimbursement or reimbursement@pacira.com, and then the phone number of 1-855-RX-XBRAL. Thank you so much, and we've really enjoyed being here today.
Yeah, thank you.